occupation, siege, international criminal court and accountability. Some international aid organisations are restricting the use of words like these in their public statements about Gaza. A DW investigation has found that such self-censorship arises from a fear that Israeli authorities will otherwise deny them the permits they need to operate.
I would say that during my time with this organization, I carried a lot of guilt.
Until recently, this woman worked for a large international aid organization doing advocacy on the occupied Palestinian territories. For months, she struggled with what her organization was asking her to do.
I felt that I was part of whitewashing the situation in Gaza. In particular, there is a feeling that you're essentially helping to hide or helping to water down the reality. It feels like you're almost being asked to lie.
DW's investigative unit reviewed internal documents and messages and spoke to workers from a dozen international aid organisations. We also analysed public statements on the occupied Palestinian territories, and specifically Gaza, published since October 2023. We found that after December 2024, many organisations started restricting their language and criticism of Israel. Some even banned certain words or phrases from their official statements.
The terms that we were not allowed to use included occupation, blockade, siege, International Court of Justice, International Criminal Court, genocide, ethnic cleansing, impunity, accountability.
There is a climate of fear about speaking out about what we've seen and what Palestinians are experiencing.
We talked to 19 former and current NGO workers. Shayna Lowe was the only one who was prepared to go on the record. There's a reason for this caution. Israel controls access to the occupied Palestinian territories, and in December 2024, it told organisations working with Palestinians that they would have to re-register. Israel requires them to submit detailed information of all staff, including Palestinians on the ground, something many oppose out of fear for their staff's safety. Organisations that are found to have supported the prosecution of Israeli soldiers in international courts or have called for a boycott of Israel will not receive a permit to operate.
Organizations are being forced to adhere to a registration process that is wholly unjust and lacks transparency. But in order to continue or try and continue to support Palestinians in Gaza, any organization that wants to operate there will have to go through this process.
As the famine intensifies in Gaza, more than 100 organisations recently took an unusual step, warning that the regulations aim to block impartial aid and silence advocacy. Confronted with the allegations, an Israeli government spokesperson told DW, Israel supports genuine humanitarian activity but will not allow hostile actors to operate under humanitarian guise. Israel currently only allows tightly controlled aid into Gaza, as international aid organisations wait for Israel's decision on their permits. Aid workers DW spoke to fear it may cut off access altogether, and their silence would have been pointless.
There is no right choice here, and in 5, 10, 15 years, when people talk about how the humanitarian community responded to the genocide, they're going to wish that they said more, and they're going to wish that they said more sooner.
Well, Naomi Conrad from DW's investigative unit worked on that report and joins me now. Welcome, Naomi. Let's start with fear versus perception. So we have these organisations feeling that if they tone down their language, Israeli authorities might grant them access to Gaza. Is there any indication that this is actually the case?
I mean, just to be clear, at the moment, no one's really allowed in. Aid is very tightly controlled. The international aid organisations are basically being circumvented by the scheme that the Israelis and Americans instigated, the so-called Gaza Humanitarian Fund. But if you look at the regulations, it's very clear what kind of language the Israelis don't want to tolerate. They're very clear that any employee of the organisation has, within the last 7 years, so it's very broad, it's going back 7 years, is not allowed to have called for a boycott of Israel. That could even include arms embargoes. So if you look at the regulations, it's very clear they're very broad, they're all-encompassing, and that's what's driving the fear. But we also know from sources that authorities have called organisations in to talk about specific interviews, for example, that members of the organisation have given. So there is a lot of scrutiny, and aid organisations are aware of this.
And have you seen examples of Israeli authorities restricting aid organisations' access to Gaza as a result of their public statements?
Well, we're going to find out in about 3 weeks. The deadline for this registration process is the 9th of September. Aid organisations at this point are extremely cautious. We've noticed that, even just trying to get people to talk on the record. There's a lot of fear. The fear is intensifying as the deadline for the registration approaches. Aid organisations have tried to negotiate with the Israeli authorities. We know that because particularly the one provision about giving complete staff lists. They're very scared of providing lists of details of their Palestinian staff. We know there has been back and forth, but the Israeli authorities did not relent on that. So it remains to be seen. We know from the Israeli side that some organisations, but we haven't heard all the names yet, have already been denied permits. But who gets a permit and who doesn't, we'll see that in the coming days, if not 2 or 3 weeks.
And if organisations can't get registered, what does that mean?
Right, that means they get 7 days to appeal, and after that, as is put down in the regulations, they have 60 days to pack their bags and leave. That's for the international staff. Then things get very complicated, and indeed, aid organisations are working on Plan Bs. So that could be that they move to Oman, that they move to Egypt. But to be clear, if they're not registered in Jerusalem, if they're not registered in Israel, they can't use Israeli routes to get aid into Gaza. That means they're now thinking about things like asking other organisations, maybe the UN, to take the aid that's stockpiling in warehouses in for them, scrambling to figure out how to pay staff. We don't know what happens to staff, Palestinian staff on the ground. We don't know what happens to their safe houses where some of the Palestinian staff in Gaza is being housed at the moment. So there are all these questions. No one really knows what's going to happen, but everyone's working on contingency plans because the assumption is that quite a few of these organisations probably won't get their permits.
And so why do your sources feel it is so important that NGOs speak out more forcefully about the situation on the ground?
I mean, to be clear, no international journalist is allowed into Gaza unless they're embedded with the Israeli army. The Israeli authorities, we know that from reporting by Israeli journalists, are also have instigated a smear campaign against Palestinian journalists. So there's a feeling that, you know, the only people who can really talk out about the situation on the ground, aside from Palestinians, of course, are these aid organisations. We've seen international doctors who've been working in hospitals in Gaza give interviews, including on DW. So if you want to silence criticism, if you want to restrict what kind of information is coming out, while at the same time you're trying maybe to smear Palestinian journalists, then the best way to silence anything coming out of Gaza is by kicking the aid organisations out or by making them restrict their language. And that's the fear that aid organisations have. I mean, aid organisations have specifically said, also in a public statement, that they're afraid that Israel is aiming to silence advocacy and to restrict aid even further with these regulations.
OK, thanks for talking us through that, Naomi. Naomi Conrad is from DW's investigative unit. Thank you so much.